In part 2 of our complete story recap of the Legend of Zelda franchise, we spoke about the fateful event known as the Interloper War, before briefly covering the events portrayed in the Capcom-developed games Minish Cap and Four Swords, following which we covered the historic conflict that is known as the Hyrule Civil War. We then moved on to talk about roughly the first half of Ocarina of Time, explaining how Link found the Master Sword in the Temple of Time, unwittingly letting Ganondorf enter the Sacred Realm. We left things off right as this momentous event took place, and Link was placed in a long slumber, one that lasts 7 years. In part 3, we will look at what happens when Link reawakens and speak about his battle against Ganondorf, before moving on to talk about the franchise's infamous timeline split. When Link reawakens from his slumber in the Temple of Light, he finds himself face to face with a man who calls himself Rauru. Rauru promptly fills Link in on everything that's happened in the time Link was asleep. 7 years have passed since Link's spirit was sealed away in the Temple of Light, within the Sacred Realm. Naturally, Link's appearances have changed accordingly as well. 7 years ago, when Link inadvertently opened the entrance to the Sacred Realm for Ganondorf by pulling the Master Sword out of the Pedestal of Time, the Gerudo King managed to get his hands on the Triforce and used its power to turn Hyrule into an apocalyptic, destroyed land of monsters and phantoms. Rauru tells Link that the Temple of Time, which houses the entrance to the Sacred Realm, was built by 7 extremely powerful magic wielders known only as the Sages. These sages were also the people who built the mechanisms that are in place for the purpose of the protection of the Master Sword and the gateway to the Sacred Realm. Though Ganondorf's hold over Hyrule is absolute and terrifying, and though his powers have devastated the land beyond recognition, Rauru tells him that there is still a way to put a stop to his rule. He tells Link that if he can combine his powers as the wielder of the Master Sword with the powers of the Sages, they would together be able to seal Ganondorf away into the Sacred Realm. Rauru, as it turns out, is one of the 7 Sages himself. He tells Link to find the other Sages who are scattered across Hyrule in various temples, or if we're speaking in game terms, dungeons, and then teleports him back to the Temple of Time. In the Temple of Time, Link runs into a rather interesting figure. He meets a mysterious man covered from head to toe in white clothes, who calls himself Sheik and claims to be a descendant of the Sheikah tribe. Sheik proves to be a very valuable ally to Link throughout his quest to find the sages across Hyrule, frequently providing him with support and vital information regarding several important things throughout the course of the game. Throughout Ocarina of Time, Sheik's appearance is kept cryptically hidden behind his clothes, with nothing but his eyes being visible to the player. From Sheik, Link learns the location of the Forest Temple, where the first of the sages resides. With that knowledge, he ventures forward, taking his first steps into Hyrule since his new awakening. When Link steps outside the temple, he finds himself in a Hyrule that is a distant ghost, an empty shell of what it had been 7 years ago. Hyrule Town now lies in ruin, ravaged, its once bustling population reduced to a few terrifying zombie-like undead creatures. Hyrule Field is perilous and swamped by enemies. Kokiri Forest is overrun by deadly beasts. Death Mountain has become a hazardous climb, true to its name. Hyrule Castle itself now lies in ruins, and in its place has been erected a daunting, sinister-looking fortress that is guarded on all sides by deep chasms and serves as the seat of power of the King of Evil, Ganondorf himself. Hyrule has essentially been transformed from a lush, beautiful kingdom into a desolate land of ruin. The next section of Ocarina of Time serves as the bulk of the game's gameplay sections, with Link traveling to different areas all across Hyrule in order to visit and best 5 different dungeons. He is able to complete the trials of 5 temples, awakening the powers of the sages within, many of whom turned out to be people Link had actually met before, prior to his slumber, when he was still a child. Awakening the 5 sages, Link successfully sends them all to the Temple of Light, one by one, joining their powers with his own. After he awakens all of them, he travels back to the Temple of Time. There he meets Sheik once again, who reveals some shocking revelations to him. Sheik pulls down the scarf that had been covering his face throughout the entire game, ever since his introduction, and finally reveals his face. It is revealed that Sheik is actually not a he. No, he is none other than Princess Zelda, who has been masquerading as a Sheikah warrior all along. And here's the kicker. As it turns out, she is also the last of the 7 sages. Zelda reveals to Link that when Ganondorf entered the Sacred Realm 7 years ago and touched the Triforce, the artifact reacted in a way no one could have predicted. The Triforce, as you know, is an embodiment of the 3 virtues of the ones who created Hyrule: Faeror's courage, Din's power, and Nehru's wisdom. As it turns out, when one touches the Triforce and tries to use its powers, it only activates if the wielder has a heart that is completely balanced and possesses all 3 of those traits equally. When Ganondorf touched the Triforce, the sacred artifact sensed that his heart did not have the right balance that it sought. As a result, it split into 3, with each of the 3 triangles that make up the relic splitting and going into different directions. The Triforce of Power went into Ganondorf, for that was the trait that he valued, the trait that he possessed more than any of the others. The Triforce of Courage chose its bearer, Link, the hero of time, who had no knowledge of this. Finally, Princess Zelda, who had been going by the name of Sheik, became the recipient of the Triforce of Wisdom. Even though Ganondorf has been able to use his newfound abilities as a result of possessing the Triforce of Power and wreak havoc across all of Hyrule for the past 7 years, he has still been striving to seek out the other 2 pieces of the Triforce, to merge the relic into one single piece once again, and to use its combined powers to grant him his true wish of ultimate and absolute power. Link, of course, was sealed away from his reach in the Temple of Light for 7 years, while Zelda herself chose to go into hiding and survive the apocalypse incurred by Ganon by adopting the persona of the ninja warrior Sheik. Zelda presents Link with light arrows, a weapon imbued with holy power that will help him in his fight against Ganondorf. Once again, though, things take a turn for the worse. In revealing herself and her true identity to Link, Zelda inadvertently alerts Ganondorf, exposing herself and her presence to the King of Evil. Ganondorf promptly arrives on the scene, having been waiting for an opportunity like this for 7 years. He kidnaps Zelda and encases her in a layer of crystal, and with her in tow, retreats to his fortress where Hyrule Castle once stood before its destruction, challenging Link to come and rescue her from his clutches if he so dares. With the stakes higher than ever, Link decides to head to Ganondorf's castle to clash against the King of Evil in a head-to-head battle. As he progresses through the fields of Hyrule towards the castle's location, he finds that getting to it is harder than he had imagined, with several obstacles created with the help of Ganondorf's dark sorcery blocking the way. With the help of the powers of the 6 sages, Link is able to cross all of these hurdles and find a way into the castle, where he finally comes face to face with Ganondorf. The Gerudo King tries to take the Triforce of Courage away from Link, but when the Hero of Time refuses to let go of the weapon, he confidently challenges him to a duel. The two engage in an epic, thrilling clash where Ganondorf uses all of his skills with weapons and with dark magic to try to defeat Link. However, Link is able to use Ganondorf's own powers against him, and after a long and arduous battle, the King of Evil is ultimately defeated. He stumbles and falls to his knees, and as he does so, the prison of crystal surrounding Zelda dissipates. In a final, desperate attempt to turn things in his favor, Ganondorf unleashes terrifying powers, destroying the foundations of his own castle. The fortress starts crumbling around them, threatening to bury them in its own ruins. Link and Zelda rush through the castle, hoping to make it out before they're crushed in the destruction, and somehow they barely manage to do so, making a very, very narrow escape. As they stand before the ruins and it starts looking like things might finally be over, Ganondorf reveals his true form. The Gerudo King rises from the rubble of his castle and proceeds to extract the Triforce of Power within himself. He uses the powers of the artifact, and absorbing it into himself, he transforms into a being that is far from human. He takes the form of Ganon, a massive, monstrous beast that is the pure embodiment of his evil soul. Link engages Ganon in a final climactic fight, and the two become locked in an epic, monumentous battle. The Hero of Time versus the King of Evil at the peak of his beastly powers. In a long-fought duel, Link uses light arrows that were given to him by Zelda before finally using the Master Sword to deal a deadly blow, following which Zelda and the other 6 sages use their powers to successfully seal Ganon away in the Sacred Realm. With Ganondorf, or Ganon as he's now become, finally defeated, his reign of terror over Hyrule is finally brought to an end, and the hope of peace is restored to the kingdom. He isn't gone permanently, of course. He ominously warns them that the Triforce of Power still resides within him, and vows that when the seal is broken, even if it's centuries from now, he will come back to ravage Hyrule once again, and in doing so, he will destroy the descendants of his mortal enemies. That said, at least for the foreseeable future, Ganondorf is gone and Hyrule has been freed from his iron grip of terror. But things aren't quite over yet, and Ocarina of Time still has a few plot threads to tie off. Zelda tells Link that though the Kingdom of Hyrule will be eternally grateful to the Hero of Time for his legendary exploits and his trouncing of the King of Evil, she is aware of the fact that in many ways, everything that has happened was set in motion by her own actions. If you really think about it, that's actually true. If 7 years ago, Zelda and Link hadn't tried to open the Door of Time using the spiritual stones and the Ocarina of Time to get to the Triforce before Ganondorf, the gate to the Sacred Realm would never have been opened. The gate, after all, couldn't be opened until the Master Sword was pulled out of the pedestal of time. No one but the one with the spirit of the hero could have done that. Zelda tells Link that it is time to undo everything that, in her estimation, was caused as a result of her own actions. She tells Link to plunge the Master Sword back into the pedestal of time, thus sealing the Sacred Realm for good. Doing so, however, would also close the gate between the different times as well, and Zelda knows that this is not a fitting reward for the Hero of Time. Because, after all, the fact still remains that much of Link's childhood was stolen away from him. Having spent years in a long slumber in the Temple of Time in the Sacred Realm, Link essentially lost 7 years of his life. Using the ocarina, Zelda plays the Song of Time, turning back the cogs of time, and sends Link back to 7 years in the past, telling him to live out his life as he would have, essentially giving him the gift of the childhood that he lost. The credits begin to roll, and it is shown that back in the present time, the time where Link, Zelda, and the sages were successfully able to defeat Ganondorf, peace and order is being restored to Hyrule. Across the land, the denizens of the kingdom are celebrating the defeat of the King of Evil. In a scene after the credits, Link is shown to have returned to his own time in the past, 7 years ago, back before he and Zelda even met. He finds himself in the body of a child again, within the Temple of Time, where he places the Master Sword back where it belongs. In the final moments of the game, Link and his fairy companion Navi are shown to be traveling to Hyrule Castle. During the exact same moment when he first met Zelda 7 years ago for the very first time, after being sent to her by the Great Deku Tree, he comes face to face with the princess again. This time though, the Hero of Time comes to her with the knowledge of everything that has happened, to warn her about Ganondorf's plans and put a stop to his machinations before they can ever be put into motion. That is where The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time ends, but of course, we're not quite done yet. Remember how earlier we spoke about how Ocarina of Time is, in no vague terms, the most important game in the entire franchise? The story of which the entire series hinges on events of this particular game. And now is when we're going to talk about exactly why and how that is the case. Bless Zelda's heart for wanting to do the right thing by sending Link back to the past 7 years ago, but in doing so, she gave rise to what can most appropriately be described as, well, one of the most painful headaches for players in the history of video games. Because the moment when Zelda sends Link back 7 years in the past is the moment that gave birth to the infamous Zelda timeline split. This is the moment that had spawned countless arguments, hours of debates, and headaches of frustration in the Zelda fanbase. At the exact juncture where Link is sent back in time to the days of his childhood, The Legend of Zelda splits into 3 separate timelines. The first timeline, known as the Adult Timeline, stays with the story of Hyrule after Ganondorf was defeated. Hyrule continues to exist without the presence of Link, who's been sent back to the past. And it is in this timeline, in the absence of the Hero of Time, that the events leading up to Wind Waker occur. The second timeline, known as the Child Timeline, follows the story of the Hyrule in the past, after Link is sent back 7 years to his childhood. In this timeline, as we see at the end of Ocarina of Time, Link informs Zelda all about the events that are about to happen, who then relays the same information to her father, the King of Hyrule. Armed with this knowledge, the royal family prematurely puts a stop to Ganondorf's plans, and as such, the events of Ocarina of Time never occur. It is in this timeline that Majora's Mask and the Twilight Princess games take place. And then there is the third and final timeline, which is called the Downfall Timeline. Unlike the other two timelines, this timeline actually doesn't follow the causality of the time paradox created at the end of Ocarina of Time. It is instead simply an alternative timeline based on a hypothetical situation, one that assumes that in his final battle against Ganondorf and his true form Ganon at the end of Ocarina of Time, the hero of time was actually killed and defeated. These events are, of course, purely hypothetical, since in neither of the two possible outcomes of Ocarina of Time's time paradox can Link actually be killed by Ganon. This, however, is the assumption that the Downfall timeline works on, and it is in this timeline that games such as A Link to the Past, A Link Between Worlds, and the original NES The Legend of Zelda takes place. There is, of course, a lot more to this split. As we move forward with this series and recap the events of the Zelda games that follow Ocarina of Time, we'll be going into greater detail about the three branching timelines and what each of them entail. In the coming parts of this series, we will talk about each of the three timelines, talking about the major events in each of them, while we will also be dedicating an installment later on purely to talk about where Breath of the Wild's placement in the timeline could possibly be. And that's where we're going to end part 3 of this series. In part 4, we will talk about the Child Timeline, which is the timeline in which Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Four Swords adventures are placed. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.